Hey, let's talk about Photoshop. Specifically, let's talk about how to use it ethically. That's really what the conversation is going to be about today, is how do we use Photoshop in a way that's still allowing us to call our work photojournalism and not running afoul of any ethical rules. These are the same kind of things that people used to deal with back when they were working in the darkroom days, sitting and exposing their pictures in scary rooms with red light bulbs surrounded by dangerous and flammable chemicals. Except nowadays they're doing it in a software package, which is much less flammable, but also can allow us to do a lot more stuff. And that's the scary part, is that we can actually make changes that are incredibly hard to detect, which makes it easy for some nefarious folks to do some pretty bad things ethically. We're allowed to do some post-processing work on the photos that we take in photojournalism to make them better, to improve them. But we have to have some guidelines before we go into that. Otherwise, things will be absolutely chaotic and bad things will happen. Ethical breaches will happen. The big baseline rule here, the stuff that you should really pay attention to, is this. Never, ever, ever use Photoshop to add anything to the photograph or remove anything from the photograph that was already there. That's not what it's there for. If you're doing photo illustrations, maybe, but photojournalism work should never have this in here. It's a huge breach of ethical norms and will lead to you getting fired, getting ostracized, and having some photojournalism professor somewhere use you as an example of being a jerk. One example that National Geographic ran into once was whether they should label something photo illustration because of their use of Photoshop. So they used this image of the pyramids at Giza in the background, some folks on camels in the front. Notice how far away those two pyramids are from each other. National Geographic realized that they really wanted to use them both for their cover, but it wouldn't fit. So they used Photoshop to squish the two together. Actually, this was before Photoshop. This was using really early rudimentary computer devices along with darkroom trickery. So if you'll notice, those pyramids are now squished together in a way that they're not actually naturally. They got in trouble for not calling this a photo illustration, and ever since then, they've made it a rule that if they're going to do anything, they have to label it photo illustration. Now, speaking of jerks who do bad things, here's Alan Detrick. He was a photographer for a couple of newspapers in Ohio, namely the Toledo Blade, and he got in trouble for photoshopping his images. He got caught after initially one photograph we'll look at in a second. And then when he got caught, they went back and reviewed all the other photographs he had turned in for his paper, and they noticed stuff like in this photograph. The left is the original, the right is where he decided, hey, you know what, this photograph would be way cooler if it had a basketball in it. It looked like they were reaching for. So he just added a basketball in the middle of it. This is the one that actually got him busted. Everyone else all the other photographers who took this picture, had a pair of feet standing behind the sign in the back there. But somehow the one he turned in didn't have the feet. And so people asked him how he did that. And it turns out that the answer was, well, he just photoshopped them out of the picture, which was incredibly unethical. Wire services in the past couple of years, or this is at least from the mid-2000s, have gotten caught doing the same thing. If you'll notice, the photo on the right is a combination of the two photographs on the left put together, which is incredibly unethical to do, and you should not do. Most of this comes from someone deciding they're going to do it once to take something very tiny out or add something very tiny in, and they get addicted to it, much like a terrible drug. And they don't get caught, so they keep doing it and keep doing it and keep making their photos supposedly better and better, when in reality they're actually just breaking everyone's trust and lying to everybody, which is a jerk move and shouldn't be done. Unfortunately, even great people sometimes find themselves surrounded in controversy. Steve McCurry is our photographer who took the photograph on the right there of Afghan Girl. We've talked about this photograph already in this class, looking at different types of photojournalism. He's sort of had a run of controversy at times. He had a gallery where someone noticed, for example, that in this photograph particularly, if you look close into what's going on with this guy with the circle over here, his foot is disappearing, and the pole doesn't quite match up there. It's sort of stopping and starting on the other side. So people looked into his work and realized that, for example, This photograph, which looks really awesome, of some kids playing soccer in a rice paddy. It looks really great. It turns out the original had an extra kid in it. If you don't believe me, back the video up a little bit and see if you can spot the difference. This photograph of some folks on a rickshaw. Turns out that if you want to play spot the differences, you can use the time slider on YouTube to have some fun here. This is the before and this is the after. He's gotten sort of caught doing this. Now his response was, well, I wasn't trying to do photojournalism. His response was, today I would define my work as visual storytelling because the pictures have been shot in many places for many reasons and in many situations. He goes on to say, reflecting on the situation, even though I felt that I could do what I wanted with my own pictures, in an aesthetic and compositional sense, I now understand how confusing it must be for people who think I'm still a photojournalist. So his argument was, well, I wasn't trying to be a photojournalist, and therefore what I did's okay. I don't know how I feel about this exactly. I think a lot of people really assumed he was still a photojournalist, and I don't know how far he went to correct them. So let's talk about how we avoid being unethical. What can we actually do? If we can't take anything out and we can't add anything using Photoshop, what can we do? Well, to start off with, we can crop. Cropping is probably the most safe thing we can do. If you ever noticed why, or ever wondered why, the symbol on Photoshop for the crop tool and any other software is what it is, it's because back in the day, you actually had a physical crop tool. It looked like this, two L-shaped rulers put together with a connecting swivel so that you could measure out exactly how much you wanted to slice out of a picture, and you do the slicing with an X-Acto knife or a razor blade. Cropping is the removal of portions of the edges of a photograph in an even manner. So it allows you to do something like take a horizontal photograph and cut off the edges to make it a vertical photograph. And like I said, this is generally considered a safe thing to do ethically in photojournalism. However, the main rule is that if you're going to crop, you have to be careful that the cropping does not impact the context of the image, which can be easy to do, right? Look at this picture in the middle, and depending on how you crop it, if you crop out the other side, either just the left or just the right, you completely change the context of the picture at hand. And there's been some real-world examples of publications getting in trouble for unethically cropping photographs. This is a photograph of former Vice President Dick Cheney having dinner with his family. He's off to the right, his family's off to the left. Texas Monthly Magazine, however, ran into trouble using this in their magazine, which is an incredibly cropped version of Dick Cheney, where it looks like he's just sort of standing over a pile of bloody meat with a knife, sort of getting rid of the rest of the family in the context that it was dinner. They kind of got in trouble for this at the time, and I don't really blame people for getting frustrated at it. In the same way, The Economist got in trouble for one of their covers, talking about the BP oil spill and the cover title, Obama versus British Petroleum, or BP. Now, the way the cover is set up, it looks like Obama is looking sad and defeated, staring at the ground out of sadness, when in reality, the actual picture is him looking at a bunch of stuff on the ground with other people around him. Beyond just cropping, here's a couple other things we can do that are ethical. The main two things that will be useful for us are dodging and burning. Dodging and burning. You can find them in the toolbar on Photoshop by looking for the tool that looks kind of like a lollipop. You click and hold it, you can change it from the lollipop to a fist to a sponge. We're not really going to use the sponge here, just dodge and burn. Dodging and burning are two old school terms for things we can do in a darkroom to either lighten a photograph up, or dodge it, or make it darker, or burn it. And they come from old school, like actual things you would do in a darkroom. So if you wanted to make a photograph dodged, you would literally put a thing over the image itself that looked kind of like a disc or a lollipop that would block the exposure light from coming down upon it. That would lighten it up. In the same way, you could burn a photograph by allowing more light to come into contact with it, thus exposing it even longer and burning it, making it darker. The general rule to ethically using the dodge and burn tool is to apply this holistically as you can. Don't try to sort of pick and choose little small bits and pieces of the photograph to do it to. Make the size of the tool relatively large, and I'll post a video on how to do this to the class, and try to apply it to as big of swaths of the photo as you possibly can. Because if you're not careful, this can, of course, go bad. We've already talked about an example in this class about how using simple tools like dodge and burn can make it for a pretty ethically bad situation, like how Time magazine made the mugshot photograph of OJ Simpson look way darker. They got into a lot of trouble for this, rightfully so. This is a very unethical thing to do. There's actually been a lot of controversy lately about using extreme levels of dodging, specifically dodging, as well as using very specific areas of dodging and manipulating the contrast of the photograph, which is essentially how heightened the difference between white and black is, to make something feel more emotional or feel more ominous. So let's look at a couple of controversial examples of that. This is one that people have pointed out before. This is before any altering of the image. This is the photo. It's a kid in a group of people who herd cattle in Central Africa. And this is once you have applied sort of over manipulating through the dodge tool or extreme use of the dodge tool as well as contrast. It makes the whole thing seem a lot more kind of bad. It makes it seem like this is a bad situation or something bad's about to happen. I actually think that doing this kind of makes it look like it's a zombie movie. You go from a nice scene of a bunch of cows and a kid to like something terrible is about to happen here. This became a really big point of debate after the 2013 World Press Photo Awards, which is a really big award if you are in photojournalism. The winner was a photograph called A Funeral in Gaza, and the winning photograph looked like this. It had amazing lighting. It was a really compelling photograph of a funeral procession to bury two kids who were killed in bombing in the Gaza Strip. However, a lot of people pointed out that the original photograph, once it made its way out, looked like this. And the color was extremely different. Here, I'll back it up once more. This is the one that won the award. This is the original. The color really has been washed out of this thing. The contrast through the contrast manipulation and using dodge has made the whole thing seem a lot more dramatic, only really through color manipulation. So it's something to be careful about. Don't overdo it. That brings us to color correction. That's a good transition there. Color correction is kind of a fancy thing. It's using the process of a really fancy mathematical formula for how wavelengths and color works together and how we perceive them in order to manipulate the perception of a color's given temperature in the shot. Now, what really, if we want to put it in layman's terms, it's this. It's adjusting white balance after you've already taken the photograph. Now, in our tech gear, sort of our gear conversation, we talked about what white balance is and how it works. It is the color temperature, or it's how your computer's or your camera's sensor, its internal computer, absorbs the color white, and how that can be different depending on how it's trying to compensate and calculate for white. But let's say you mess it up. Let's say you take a picture and the white balance is off, and you end up with a bunch of bluish colors in the background. Color correction is, instead of using white balance before the photo is taken, it is correcting it afterwards. It's adjusting how the colors are actually embedded in the photograph itself and making it seem more natural. And that really is the key to all this. All of this should be to make it seem more like reality, not make it better than reality. That's our next big question, our next big thing coming up here. In society, the big thing we're looking at now is color correction as a big controversial issue in photojournalism. This is a photograph from a protest in Egypt. And people pointed out that this is the original photograph. And if you color correct the photograph, just using basic things in Photoshop, you make it look like this, which almost looks like a completely different photograph. Here's again on the left is the one with color correction, on the right without. So there's been a lot of questions in press photography nowadays of how much color correction is too much color correction. And I really don't know the answer to that, because Photoshop's only going to get better at this. So my personal rule, and I think the rule you ought to have, is this. Really, with color correction or with dodging and burning or anything manipulating contrast, anything that you're doing in Photoshop, is that you can use Photoshop to do what you could already do in the camera anyway. Things like shutter speed and aperture, you can even adjust color saturation and contrast in the camera itself. So all you're doing in Photoshop is changing things that were set incorrectly in the camera. But the issue now is that Photoshop is so good at holistic color correction that you can go above and beyond what the camera could do. So here's a good rule set. Photoshop should really only be used to fix small errors holistically. You shouldn't be inventing all new pictures. You should just be correcting the ones you have by using big, wide swaths of correction holistically. Fix as much of the picture as you can, as opposed to doing small detail work. Photoshop should be used only for things that can otherwise be adjusted within the camera itself. Only things like lightening and darkening, contrast, saturation, etc. You only want to be changing things that the camera could do. And a life lesson here, if you do any edits yourself in Photoshop and you are freelancing and you're selling your photographs off, or if you're working for a publication, either as a full-timer, as an intern, whatever, if you do any edits in Photoshop, send both versions and make it clear which one is which. Let the people who are publishing the photograph decide which one they want to use. Of course, if you're using your own publication, if you've started your own publication, if you're using your own website, etc., my rule is this. And again, the purpose of editing in Photoshop should always be to make the picture more like reality, not to make it better than reality. And with that, go out and work ethically.